morning, we will continue with our seminar, Public Policy Making for the Improvement of Quality of Life, Well-being, and Human Capabilities to Overcome Inequalities. Today, our session will be dedicated to the topic of redefining urban inequalities in relation with quality of life, well-being, and human capabilities, the importance of citizens' participation. Let's begin with the concept of inequality. The study of inequalities acquired importance during the 19th and expanded during the 21st century. First, developing in the field of economics, and in this regard, we can quote the general definition that inequality is the size of the relative differences in resource endowments between units belonging to a particular environment by Pettinato. But another author, Cambour, said that the study of the economic dimension of inequality has a long history and is not only important per se, but also linked to many other topics in the social sciences field. The Nobel Prize of Economics, Amartya Sen, in 1998, explains that inequality has been traditional assessed in terms of income, neglecting other types of inequality, such as, for example, poor health, lack of education, and social exclusion. Sen argues that the analysis of inequality must consider the choice of space, that is, the variable in terms of which inequality is assessed. So there is a consensus regarding the existence of multiplicity of inequalities today. For example, inequalities of gender, inequalities of age, inequality in relation with levels of education, inequalities to access to the labor market, inequalities in relation with geographic location, for example, the type of neighborhood where the people live, inequalities to access to basic services, inequality to individual traits, and as well as the characteristics of the public policies of the country in which the persons live. Yes? In the 21st century, inequalities by age and by gender are considered among the determining axes of the distribution of well-being and power in a society, because they are one of the bases of the social organization around which responsibilities and roles are assigned. So consider the importance of these two types of inequalities. Likewise, the convergence of multiple inequalities characterize the hard cores of poverty, of vulnerability, and of social exclusions, and makes them persist and reproduce. So in this sense, inequalities matter to the well-being and prosperity of a society. Well, if we speak about the types of inequalities, we can identify different types besides the income and socioeconomic level, namely gender inequality, as we have said recently, ethnic and racial inequalities, inequalities related to the life cycle, especially childhood, youth, and old age, territorial inequalities between, for instance, rural and urban zones, and between the different regions of each country. All those dimensions intersect and potentiate each other, particularly affecting certain population groups today, such as, for example, indigenous people and Afro-descendant women. The concept of inequality in the 21st century. Okay, we will say that since the late 19th and all through the 21st century, Different authors have studied and classified inequality. So today we have a classification. So we will next review the most outstanding contributions. The first one is the classification of inequalities between traditional and new inequalities. Another possibility is to study inequalities from the point of view of capabilities. A new one classification is consider the horizontal inequalities. Other possibility is to study categorical inequalities. Then recently appeared two other types, intersecting inequalities and relational inequalities. These are the classification that we have today. Perhaps in the future we can have another classification, yes, because it's an ongoing concept, yes. Okay, first we will stop and study traditional and new inequalities. In 1996, two French researchers, Fitoussi and Rosanbayon, identified new dimensions of analysis of inequalities and proposed a study of two types of inequalities, traditional inequalities and what they called new inequalities. The traditional inequalities that also have been called structural inequalities have been traditionally studied and internalized by society, being fundamentally associated with the economic dimension. For example, to have more money or to have less money, yes? That's the traditional. The new inequalities that appear during this century involve other dimensions of analysis, such as social inequalities, cultural inequalities, religious inequalities, and other ones. These two authors, Fitoussi and Rosanbayon, noticed that the new inequalities could disturb the representation that people can have of themselves and can therefore affect identity. And also pointed out that when inequalities increase, they affect the structure of the whole society. So the perception of the increase in inequalities in a society can be generated from a weakening of the principles of equality in society, an increase in structural inequalities, and the emergence of new inequalities. So all this results in a process in which the three categories are dependent on each other. Let's speak about categorical inequalities. Well, the author for Charles Tilly, who made reference to categorical inequalities by expressing that inequality is a relation between persons or set of persons in which the interaction generates greater advantage for one than for the other. Yes. The author argues that inequality situate people on one side or on the other side of the categorical boundaries. The categories are crucial because they shape both inequalities and identities. These classifications set categorical limits which people use to organize social life and reproduce the inequality between members of the different categories. Another possibility is to study inequalities from the point of view of Nobel Prize Amartya Sen, who founded the capability approach. Sen stated that inequalities must be studied on the basis of choice of space, as well as other relevant variables such as well-being, freedom, and the different aspects of quality of life. In addition, Sen explains that inequality has been traditionally assessed in terms of income, thus neglecting other types of inequality. However, he argued that income inequality can differ significantly from inequality in other spaces, and that the contrast between the different perspectives of income and capability has a direct impact on the space in which inequality is to be examined. Sen proposed the capability approach that identifies freedom as a major principle of development. And in this respect, the capability approach represents a theoretical proposition for the assessment of life satisfaction, perception of social situations, design of public policies which affect economic development, social policies, and international development. The capability approach provides an overarching structure for the understanding and measuring of equality, which focuses on what matters to people, recognize the diversity in needs, lays emphasis on barriers, constraints, structures, and processes, while recognizing diversity as regards goals. Another possibility to study inequalities is to take the option that proposed Francis Stewart. Francis Stewart also is in line with Sen. She said that inequality is a major source of injustice and a cause of poverty, and sometimes of conflict, thus adopting a plural approach to inequality by encompassing several important dimensions. She said that the vertical model of inequality is based on ranking, for example, individuals, households, by their income, their assets, or human capabilities. Inequality in income, specifically distribution, is a summary measure of the dimension of income and employment, which provides only a partial indicator of the other dimensions. Besides being a vertical measure, since it considers the member of a society from top to bottom, measuring their income and the consequent inequality. This is when she speaks specifically about vertical inequalities. Her proposal is horizontal inequality. So the author proposed a horizontal measurement of inequality, which would measure the inequality between groups defined by region, ethnicity, class, and or religion, according to the most appropriate type of group identification in each particular society. These groups are socially defined by their members or by others, often based on common cultural characteristics and behavior, appearance, or place of birth, for example, or place of residence. Horizontal inequalities greatly affect people's well-being directly, as well as other objectives, since people are affected not only by their individual circumstances, but also by how well their group is doing. Since being part of a group is often an important aspect of a person's identity, will cut across the economic categories and are related particularly to social discrimination. Well, let's speak about another type of classification, intersecting inequalities. Intersecting inequalities combine both horizontal inequalities and vertical inequalities characteristics. Yes, the two approaches, vertical and horizontal, focus on distinct axes of disadvantage, resources in the first time, and identity. The vertical approach to inequalities is focused on income, and the horizontal approach to inequalities is based on social discrimination, which takes into consideration the social identity of different groups. So, give rise to social exclusion are deeply entrenched in the historical structures and everyday practices of societies, making them appear remarkably resistant to change. Group-based inequalities are the product of cultural norms, values, and practices that enable the participation as equal citizens in the life of their communities. Yet people may suffer social discrimination without necessarily facing material deprivation. And this is a textual phrasal of Cavier and Santos, it is the intersection between these different forms of inequality that serves to define the most severe and often the most enduring form of social exclusion in societies. Well, and let's go on with the final classification, relational inequalities. This is an original proposal in the study of inequality. It's very new. It's the one that focuses on relationships, which has led us to review the research work developed first by Ghosh. This is the author. The author believes that human beings are inherently social and that their individual capacities are socially regulated and in turn regulate their own social relationships. These interactions, likewise, undergo changes in time and are affected by the dynamics of broader economic and social processes. Though traditionally most debates on distributive inequality have generally been focused on material goods or on services. And today there is a recognition on what is known as relational equality, which involves egalitarianism, as well as the demands of contemporary social movements. The affirmation goes beyond distributive inequality, for it acknowledges different kinds of social and hierarchical inequality, particularly in the form of persistent group inequalities, which are sustained by laws, by norms, or by our habits that generate higher or lower levels of social interaction. So, after make this revision to all the type of inequalities that are studied till now, we will go on the study of inequalities, particularly in the urban space. During the last decades, urban expansion and the decentralization of employment policies have become the processes with the highest incidence on spatial mismatch, since these processes have changed people's home location options as well as their job opportunities. The new economy has boosted urban inequality in three different ways, namely a greater labor market bifurcation, resulting in a deepened income inequality, an increase in interurban inequality, and the resurgence of central cities, which have gradually become more unequal, for example, greater classification and inequality between the different suburban areas. So we need to go deep in the concept of spatial inequality. Spatial inequality are differences in development associated with place-based characteristics such as remoteness, high density, or poor municipal infrastructure provision, and often coincide with intersecting inequalities. Spatial inequalities often overlap with intersecting inequalities, for example, in socially excluded groups concentrated in the most disadvantaged locations and neighborhoods. So these social, economic, and spatial inequalities in turn contributed to political disenfranchisement. Such groups were generally denied voice and influence in collective decisions that affected their lives. Although the debates on urban inequality have given greater relevance to the study of residential segregation patterns, the different dimensions of urban inequality are interactively intervened and interrelated. And the existence of these interrelations between different dimensions or form of urban inequality reinforces the need to expand the studies in that field. So, go on in the study of urban inequalities in relation with quality of life and well-being. When analyzing urban inequality in the 21st century, quality of life and well-being should also be taken into account, a focus which several authors have begun to adopt. This is the case of Barley, Milton, and Satterthwaite, who refer to urban housing by pointing out that urban inequalities are expressed through highly stratified spatial realities, structured both by the market and by government. Contrasts can be identified in urban housing quality, density, and levels of provision with significant implications for health and for quality of life. It is likewise possible to observe that database economy is definitely concentrated in urban areas, thus generating new forms of spatial inequality, both within and between cities and urban populations. There has been a widening of the income gap. Disparity in cities has increased. The suburbs have been broadly reclassified according to social groups, ethnic, and cultural origins. If, on the other hand, we analyze the relationship between quality of life and urban mobility, we should consider the research work carried some years ago, more than a decade ago, by Giampaolo Nuvolati, who regards the concept of accessibility of services and public transport as crucial in the assessment of quality of life in the city. Accessibility of services may be assessed on the basis of educational, cultural, and economic disparity. It may also be approached in terms of traffic, public transportation system, and other issues related to urban mobility. During the last decades, new forms of production have emerged. Digital, database, consumer-oriented, which point to unprecedented urbanization in the world economy. This is what Scott calls the third wave. Okay, but what happened with community well-being? Well, the urban space is very big. Well, what about the neighborhoods, for example? Okay, if we speak about community well-being, and if we revisit daily life in urban communities, community well-being is worth taking into account. Community well-being is the combination of social, economic, environmental, cultural, and political conditions properly identified to flourish and reach their full potential. Also, community well-being has generally referred to the social, the cultural, and psychological needs of the subjects, their families, and their own communities. So the definition of community well-being was influenced by health, poverty, public transportation, economic activity, as well as by environmental and ecological considerations. And what is well-being? Well, in this regard, the notion of well-being ought to be considered not only from a personal perspective, but also in social terms, because we are speaking about communities, yes? Since the opportunities are of equal importance, whether they are offered to a group or to an individual, which means that all definitions of well-being should be contextualized, taking into account both the population and the place in which its members develop their daily lives. Yes? Another important concept is the concept of life satisfaction. At this point, the concept of life satisfaction ought to be clarified, for it represents a report of the way in which individuals assess their lives as a whole, whether at a certain point in time or the evaluation of their life development since they were born, since a childhood. And since the question about their general life satisfaction allows people to make a fundamental connection with the feelings they are experiencing at the moment, the questions that should be asked must be related to the specific dimensions of this person's lives to obtain a more concrete assessment of the situations they are going through. So, two different concepts: well-being, would it be personal or community well-being, and a little concept inside is life satisfaction. In the concrete case of community satisfaction, the latter implies satisfaction with several situations. This is something I proposed more than a decade ago. You need to study the perception of safety on the streets and the perception of safety in public places people have, the members of the community, as I know. Social services in the community, interaction with their neighbors, equipment and infrastructure, public transportation, if there is public transportation, the possibility that people have to work in the community, the enjoyment of leisure time with other members of the community people have, and also the possibility of exchanging points of view and discussing worries and problems of mutual concern. These are some things you can analyze when you take contact with the community to try to study the community satisfaction and the community well-being. And then go on a little reflection about public policy to overcome inequalities in urban space. Well, the analysis of the public policies to overcome inequalities lead us to the notion that though social inequalities measure culturally and historically and varies from one moment or from place to another, it can still be argued that contemporary inequalities are mostly determined by the prevailing forms of production and associated to labor relations which tend to operate at larger, even in global scales. Yes? The previous characteristics are vital to the analysis and design of public policies, which have led us to the study of inequalities directly in relation with democracy. The national government plays a fundamental role in the elimination of the inequalities of a country. But in this regard, particularly local government is more often the official level through which inequalities in services and provisions are addressed. Yes, people ask for help to the local government. In his paper on lateral thinking, Tony Atkinson tackled these conceptual issues by pointing out that inequality excels the income. And he raised the question of inequality in other dimensions, for example, such as health or education. And in this line, Cambur states that the main conceptual point lies in the fact that the correlation between income and health is a natural source of inequality, detached from income inequality and health inequality per se. Yes, they are very important each other, but they are naturally in relation. This ought to be considered when it comes to deciding on public policies on the matter, for example. So Atkinson identified 5 ideas in the distribution of income to mitigate inequality: technology, employment, social security, the sharing of capital, and taxation. And according to Cambur, what Atkinson proposes aims at a general improvement regarding social protection and security, achieved through the universal right to a basic income in a new system of social security. So these authors, the two, particularly put the concept of social security in the scene. So we will return to Sen because Sen has a definition of the concept of social protection system. And for Sen, the social protection systems is a stable social protection framework, the state's fundamental institutional mechanism, as well as the citizens' extraordinary support in emergency situations. In this respect, also, Fitoussi and Rosanvallon, that we previously spoke about them, also proposes social protection system too, but saying that it's necessary to contemplate the subjects, the person's biographical trajectories, to prevent the incidents that may occur in their daily lives, deriving in social determinants of the life of the people. So consider that this whole author put the axis in the person, no? Not in the institutions, yes? So we have further considered also the research work of inequality developed by Joseph Stiglitz, another Nobel Prize of Economics. He proposes an extension of individual rights. For example, he proposes public policies to mitigate inequality. Also, Stiglitz proposed an active participation of civil society as public assets that may function to control abuse of power and influence, and also corruption. No? So finally, we'll speak about the importance of citizens' participation. Well, citizens' participation is important, it's very important in the process of policy decision. And of course, trying to reduce inequality. For citizens cannot only be considered as a natural category, like only the right to vote, since it depends on public and intersubjective relationships. In the last decades of the 20th century, the notion of citizenship has undergone a process of redefinition that made recognition and diversity visible, giving rise to the issue of ethnic and gender identities. thus expanding the debate on the classic notion of citizenship from the discourse that promotes integration to one of the recognition of diversity. Today, we can recognize two outlooks on citizenship. One considered traditional and which covers the citizens' relations with the states, with the society, and the rules of participation in public life. And another one defined as new citizenships, which has emerged as a result of the process of globalization, the advance of technology, migration movements, intercultural processes, and social recoveries. So the different processes of acquisition and transformation of citizenship take place around the processes that shape social life and the individual's life trajectories. This is based on a dynamic and relational conception of citizenship, in which social practices are the center of the argument, and in which citizenships, in its multidimensional character, is conceived as being composed by a few elements whose specific interrelation defines its social dynamics in each group or social context. Citizens' participation is a set of actions through which citizens become involved in the design, in the decision, and in the implementation of public affairs affecting or concerning them. I propose a use of quality of life research and human capabilities research results for the decision of public policies, which may enable governments to identify the needs of a society and design public policies that may generate programs to boost people's quality of life and reduce the inequalities. So finally, our reflection about seeking to overcome inequalities. So, quoting Cambur, in other words, the inequality studies research field has made contributions in conceptual and theoretical issues, on the one hand, and far-reaching investigation of empirical problems, on the other. Having completed this tour, we can conclude in accordance with Cambur that inequalities are multidimensional in theory, outcomes, and causes, encompassing the economic, the social, and the political. Economic forces are not the only ones playing on inequality, but they are important by themselves and in conjunction with others. So a society with fewer inequalities requires a government that considers the current environmental challenge, migration, and the increasing healthcare costs. Moreover, an equal society recognizes the individual's diverse needs, situations, and goals, and seeks to expand their capabilities by doing away with discrimination and prejudice while tackling the economic, political, legal, social, and physical conditions that constrain people's achievements and limit their substantial freedom. To overcome inequalities, a society first needs to identify existing inequalities and make decisions to resolve them. To do this, it is necessary to generate public policies in response to the social problems of the population, as well as counting on citizens' participation to achieve this. So I invite you to read my recent book. Yes, I know that it will be available till July of this year, so in 3 3 or 4 weeks. The name of the book is Urban Inequalities, a Multidimensional and International Perspective. The book proposes an interdisciplinary and multidimensional perspective of urban inequalities, analyzes the situation of children, youth, and indigenous people, highlights the importance of policymaking and citizen participation in overcoming inequalities, also include chapters about housing, about climate change, so about different situations, particularly in the field of economics. So we are trying this book to include all different topics and studies from different parts of the world. I have authors that write chapters from the 5 continents, so you can see all the different situations of inequalities that people are living today. Okay, this is my mail, my university, and now we can have a time to questions, and then we will do the workshop.